Okay, I had to switch cameras out. I've got two cameras going and not able to really manage either one of them very well, so that makes it just so much fun for everybody. Anyway, telling you guys about the Virginia Plan. So the Virginia Plan, which is, I already told you, the blueprint of the Constitution, of course, presented by Edmund Randolph early on in the Constitutional Convention, but really the brainchild of James Madison, who's often perceived as the father of the Constitution because of that. It called for the getting rid of the scrapping of the Articles of Confederation, and the idea was that that was a dysfunctional form of government. It would no longer work anymore. In a radical suggestion calling for a stronger, more centralized government, and that stronger, more centralized government would be based upon a three-branch system of government. Now, I do want you guys to know that the founding fathers, the Constitution, James Madison and others, did not invent this. This was a pre-existing situation. In origin, often perceived in Great Britain, where they had their kind of understanding of the judicial component of the legislative component, of course, the executive in terms of the monarchy. And each state had a three-branch system of government, but now this will be employed for the national government, of course. And indeed, that is a very important way of strengthening a government. So I'm just going to kind of draw this out for you guys and get us a little closer to the blackboard here. So I'm sure you guys have a sense of how this all works, but in a three-branch system of government. But first of all, of course, you start with the branch that makes the law, and the branch that makes the law is called the, say it before I write it, the legislative branch. Now, in the Virginia Plan, the legislative branch would be manifest by a bicameral legislature. So now we're going from that unicameral to bicameral. And of course, bicameral means, and isn't it fun to get to see my writing again? I bet you guys missed that. Anyway, bicameral means two houses, of course, so subdivided. The so-called lower house would become known as the House of Representatives, and the so-called upper house would be named in honor of the Romans. It will be called the Senate. Okay, so a bicameral legislature instead of the unicameral that had been there before. Okay. And this bicameral legislature will make the laws, of course. And, you know, Congress was already doing that, so you're not exactly coming up with something new there, but, you know, they're going to add to that, of course. So that's just one branch. Not only would there be a branch, of course, to legislate, but there would be a branch to administer the laws, and the administrative branch, of course, is called in the three-branch system of government. I'll give you 3 seconds to say it. Yes, it is the executive branch. And the executive branch would be headed by a, 1, 2, 3, I think I already said it, indeed a president, whoops. And the president, of course, would be given all the apparatus necessary to make sure that they could effectively administer the laws that had been created by Congress. And then the third branch would be designed to adjudicate the laws. And the branch which adjudicates the law, of course, is called, 1, 2, 3, shout it out as your, yes, indeed, it is called the Judicial Branch. It's been so long since I've written anything. Oh, no. My makeshift classroom is falling apart. Anyway, the Judicial Branch. And the Judicial Branch will be headed up, of course, by a Supreme Court. Now, this is all you really need to be an effective government. You know, there's not much more that you're going to need any particular kind of way. We'll go and close there one time before we go back out. You know, you need something to make the law. You need some component to administer the law. You need some component to judge the law, adjudicate the law. And, you know, by creating a three-branch system of government, you create all of the apparatus you really need, of course, to be effective in terms of governance. So, one of the things that just becomes part of the Virginia Plan is the creation of a three-branch system of government. The fourth and final thing, and there's more to this, of course, especially for the identification, and this has become the controversial component, is it created a system of representation that very much favored the larger states. This is very much, you know, just the attitude of Virginia. Virginia despised the Articles of Confederation, the Congress, because it didn't recognize the size and importance and population of Virginia. So in a, you know, here's the great state of Virginia, and yet your vote can be canceled out by little teeny old Rhode Island, and Virginia didn't like that, you know. So they wanted to make sure that the new government would reflect more, of course, the size and importance of the individual state. So they created a system that would definitely represent that would favor the larger states. So the way they did this in the Virginia plan was to create a ratio for the election of the House of Representatives. And you were to receive one representative for every 40, I can't remember if it's 40,000, I want to say 44,000, for every 44,000 people that you had in your state. So of course, a state like Virginia, who had a large population, would receive more representation than a state like Rhode Island, okay? And this is exactly what the Virginians wanted. So in the House of Representatives, clearly, of course, the large states would be dominant, and that's the way it is, right? California has the largest congressional caucus, I think 58 representatives, because we have the largest population by far. Texas is the second largest, so they're going to have a fairly substantial representation also. And of course, small states, population states like Wyoming are going to have many fewer representatives. Now, here's the thing that ultimately became the controversy. So the large states would dominate the House of Representatives, of course, but then the way that the Virginia plan had it happening was that the House of Representatives would elect the Senate. So the large states would be dominant not just in the House of Representatives, but in the entire government, of course. So, and this was the Virginia plan to make sure that, in this case, lowercase p, the plan to make sure that Virginia and the larger states, of course, had their power recognized in no uncertain terms. Well, I'm sure you can guess who's going to be unhappy with this. The small states are like, what about us? Here they are, these little teeny states, of course, and just kind of freaking out. And indeed, this was a motivating factor for the creation of a different plan, and it was called the New Jersey Plan. And it was a plan, of course, that tried to move backwards in a very serious way, to try to maintain the Articles of Confederation and maintain the relative power of the small states, essentially. But it didn't gain much traction, okay? But the reality was, as long as the Virginia plan was so much in favor of the large states, of course, this wasn't going to go. And there had to be something to be worked out here. And a critical component of the Constitutional Convention, and I would have to argue a critical component of life and a critical component of our government all the time, I would hope, is that they're going to have to figure out some way to compromise this. You're going to have to find some kind of a meeting of the minds here. And the way they did this, and it's often known as the Great Compromise as far as the convention is concerned, they couldn't, the committees of the whole Congress, the whole group could not decide, figure this out, okay? So they created a smaller committee, and that committee had members from large states and smaller states, and they went into their own private room and they tried to figure this out. They tried to hash this out, and a central figure was a man by the name of James Wilson, who came from Pennsylvania, and they came back with what is always going to be known as the Great Compromise. They write that down to make sure that we get that, the Great Compromise, because this will allow, of course, the discussion to continue. And the Great Compromise is something that is totally functional. It will really work, of course, and it will allow the smaller states to at least feel like they're not going to be just blown away by the emerging new governing apparatus. So I'm sure you guys know how this works. In the Virginia plan, of course, the House of Representatives, that's supposed to be Rep House. Would you elect the Senate? What would happen, of course, in the I'm not missing my writing. You're probably not missing my writing either. It's horrible. But in this new compromise, of course, indeed the House of Representatives will be based upon population base, so that means the larger states will have more people. But in the Senate, the way they're going to do this is, that in the Senate, every state will have 2 representatives. So equality as far as the Senate is concerned. In the House of Representatives, the state of California is massively powerful. In the Senate, there are just 2 senators, of course, and there's 2 senators from Vermont, and there's 2 senators from Wyoming, and there's 2 senators from Rhode Island. So in the Senate, and the idea really was to recognize the equality of the individual states. And then one thing I think is just so interesting is how this does really work. In the large states, the big states have, in the House of Representatives, the big states have a lot of power. But in the Senate, it really is the smaller states that have a power, both in kind of a good way and kind of a bad way. The small states tend to re-elect their senators time after time. And seniority is always a critical thing. You become the heads of committees, and you get to dictate kind of the way that the things are going to work as far as the Senate is concerned. And small states like Wyoming and small states like Utah, I feel like my entire life, Orrin Hatch has been the senator from Utah. It just seems like he goes on and he goes on and on. Anyway, in the Senate, the small states are powerful. there's some bad parts about this, and this is more of a modern phenomenon. But these small states are able to have kind of exert more power than really they should deserve. It's kind of like the problem of the Electoral College, that smaller states have a little too much say. And the states that have large populations and the states that have large urban populations. And I have to tell you, I mean, it is really a Democrat-Republican issue. The Republicans are in small states, of course, and they have an inordinate amount of power relative to the Democrats in large states who have significantly more voters, oftentimes, in the national election than those the candidates that are running in the Republican office. Anyway, it creates a balance, though, and the critical part of the compromise was that it allows the conversation to continue, of course, and that they will begin to work through more and more of the various issues. Now, I want you to know that compromise is just critically important in the entire story. And you have to kind of have a sense of it. You've got these two entities that are duking it out, the larger states and the smaller states, and trying to figure out what they can gain from it. So all this give and take. And so, for instance, like the large states, they would concede, okay, you guys can have your Senate, and you guys can be powerful there, but they wanted something back. And so what they got was they said that all appropriations, that means all spending that takes place out of Congress, has to start in the House of Representatives. So every money bill has to start here. It's not going to start in the Senate. And the idea was that the large states have to pay the bills. They put more revenues into the government coffers, so they should have more power in determining how the money of the government is spent. And so the smaller states would say, okay, you guys, we'll give you that. But they'd want something back in return. So they would say, what we want is the power to ratify all foreign treaties. So that's the way it works, right? The Senate has the power to ratify foreign treaties. I just went through in History 102 how the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, the Peace of Paris, the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I. So the Senate has that particular kind of power. And so the large states would say, oh, okay, you guys can have that, but they want something in return. So here's one thing that the large states called for. They said, we want the Senate to be one vote per person. There were some who thought maybe the Senate, it's 2 people per state, and so they will simply vote by state. It isn't that far from being, unreasonable here. But instead, the large states demanded that each individual senator have their own vote. So every state has 2 votes in the Senate. And, I think the important point of this is, in much of my growing up years, California always had one Republican senator and 1 Democratic senator. And I raised the wrong arms right there too, right arm, left arm. 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. And, and those guys routinely would not vote with each other, right? I mean, they're both from 2 different parties. So it really changes the dynamic of the Senate by guaranteeing that there are 2 votes. And the smaller states would say, okay, I guess we can let you guys have that. But they want something in return. And so they then said, we want the power to confirm all Supreme Court appointees and Supreme Court justices. And so the Senate then gains the power to do that. So they're fighting back and forth, tooth and nail, trying to get whatever little part of the equation they possibly can. Now, one of the great debate issues was not between large state and small state, but between the North and the South. I mean, that became a much more interesting one. And the whole thing had to do with the slaves, and specifically how to count the slaves. Now, intriguingly, everyone wanted to count the slaves, but they wanted to count them for different reasons. In the North, they wanted to count them for purposes of taxation. And of course, the Southerners would say, they don't have an income, they don't pay taxes, that seems unfair. But the South wanted to count them for purposes of representation. I told you there's a ratio here. So the more people you have, the more representatives you're going to get. And if you can count the slaves, that's going to amp up your representation in a significant way. Well, just to show you kind of the strangeness sometimes of the way these things work out, the way they're going to solve this problem, it's very famous, or actually I would say infamous in terms of the Constitution, is, do you know what it is before I put it up here for you? I hope you know. You may have heard of the 3/5 rule. So that means that there was a compromise decision that they would count 3/5 of all the slaves. And I have to tell you, it's weird in so many ways. I mean, 3/5, what a weird thing. Why not 1/2? That seems fair. But I have to tell you, this is really problematic in many ways. This is going to give the South a tremendous amount of power relative to the North in lots of ways, including like the Electoral College. They get to count the slaves in terms of, something like the Electoral College. But, here's how it's an issue. The state of South Carolina was 70% black, 70% slaves. So the white population is small and the slave population is very substantial. And yet they get to count 3/5 of all those slaves for representation. And that means that in real terms, the individual voter in South Carolina, has more weight than the individual voter in Massachusetts. They don't have that same kind of situation. And it's a foundation of what would later be known as the slave power, that the southern states really did have kind of an extra edge in just about everything in terms of what happened in our national government. So this was it's a compromise, shows the compromise dynamic of the situation, but it also shows, maybe the problematic nature of some of these compromises. Anyway, they worked their way through all of this stuff in what must have been just the superheated atmosphere of Independence Hall. To go in secrecy, they had to close the doors, they had to close the windows. I mean, that Philadelphia's got to be hot and humid in the summer. It must have been miserable upon occasion. Sometimes I wonder if they stripped down to nothing. There's a bunch of fat naked guys sitting there kind of trying to discuss this stuff. But at some point, they began to kind of emerge with a consensus of what exactly is happening. So here is the end of kind of what's going to happen. The emerging Constitution is beginning to show itself. So, fundamental components of what will come out of this convention is, first of all, that the Constitution will emerge to become the law of the land. And so that means that the Constitution is the primary law of the United States of America. All other laws are secondary to it. State and local laws are secondary to it. So, and by the way, this is a citizenship exam question. What is the law of the land of the United States of America? The law of the land is the Constitution of the United States. So one critical decision: the Constitution will reign supreme. It is the primary law of the United States of America. Another really important outcome that's going to appear, it's the so-called implied powers. Implied powers. And the implied powers are, one thing about the Constitution is that it is short and it is relatively vague, and that's both a strength and, some would argue in some cases, a weakness essentially. But it has this way of suggesting things, that become really critically important. So the so-called implied powers, and what this is going to do, of course, is really increase the relative power of the government. So what it says in the Constitution is that the government shall have all necessary and proper powers to be effective. Necessary and proper. And necessary and proper, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, is subject absolutely to interpretation. What is necessary? What is proper? And of course, that becomes dependent upon that particular moment. So it might become necessary and proper, of course, to wage war against a whole bunch of states that tried to leave the Union or something like that. Or it may be necessary and proper to send soldiers down to escort 9 African-American students into Central High School in Little Rock. Or it might be necessary and proper to invade into Panama and steal out Manuel Noriega, or to bomb Libya, or to conduct a coup in some other, I don't know where, in Chile or something like that. Or it may be necessary and proper, of course, to waterboard people in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. And I want you guys to know that I don't think that's true. I mean, there's got to be a limitation here. You can't go forever. And when the Americans began to venture into the realm of torture, which John McCain and many others denounced, essentially, I mean, you don't want to go to the dark side sometimes. So there are certain things that are never going to be proper. And I would say for the United States, torture will never be proper, no matter what. I mean, I'm sorry, no matter what the issue is, there's certain things, there's lines that we shouldn't cross. And yet, of course, you guys know that there are black ops sites and there are behaviors of American agents around the world that I'm sure we would all just be horrified to know stuff about. But what this is really doing, just in the general, of course, it's greatly expanding the potential powers of the United States, of the government of the United States of America. So the implied powers are a huge component of the emerging Constitution. That finally, here we are creating a government that's really potentially very powerful. And I told you, as part of the colonial political culture, that the thing they feared more than anything else was power, and that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we have to know that in creating a stronger, more centralized government, the founders still wanted to do what they could to sustain liberty, in the face of this. So they're going to create the very famous system of checks and balances. This is a critical way to do everything they possibly can to protect the liberties of the people of the United States of America. Now, do understand that we often look at our government and we kind of, chide it for being so cumbersome and so slow to act upon things. But this was by design. The idea was that every single thing the government does has to be considered from multiple perspectives by different entities, each one of which has the power to basically say, no, this is not necessarily a good idea. Efficient governments, that could be good, but that could be dangerous. One of the most efficient governments in the history of the world was the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler. I mean, the guy just snapped his fingers and stuff happened, right? He said, build me a road system, of course. They built the Autobahns, and he said, rebuild the military, and they began to rebuild the Abwehr, the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, you know. He said, kill me the Jews, and they're going to kill Jews. They're going to kill Jews on an industrial scale. So efficient governments have this potential to be extraordinarily dangerous, and the United States, of course, wanted to position itself in a way where they would always be deliberate about what they were doing and always contemplate what they and consider it time and time again. Now, I hope you guys have some sense of the checks and balances, but I'm going to use my board again here to kind of make sure that we understand it. And of course, this would be a time where I would want a ton of participation. I don't think I'm going to get it from my camera. But here's my question I would have asked, of course, if the House of Representatives passes a bill, is it the law? And I'm sure some of you are saying, no, it's not. And then I would say, well, what has to happen next? And some of you would say, well, that bill has to go to the Senate. And then I would say to you, does the Senate have to accept what the House wrote? And you would say, no, they don't. And I would say, if the Senate, of course, wants to change it, what has to happen? And then you would say, that has to go back to the House of Representatives. Does the House of Representatives have to accept those changes? No, and so we could have this bouncing back and forth. This bicameral legislature requires two bodies to decide upon something, right? And one says no, then it's not going to happen, essentially. So here, right, you've got just within the Congress itself, you have the system of checking and balancing. Now, if both the House and the Senate agree to it, they both pass the bill, is it now the law? And of course, you're going to tell me, no, it's not the law even yet. So what has to happen next, of course, is the law has to go to the president. And what can the president do? I've asked that question, I don't know how many, perhaps hundreds of times over the course of my career, and almost always the students shout out veto. And I love that because it just, it's like if everyone became a president, what are you going to do when you become a president? I'm going to veto a whole bunch of crap, Now the reality is the president rarely vetoes things. Vetoes are relatively uncommon, most of the time they're going to sign off on the bill, but that is one thing that they could do, of course. Now, if the president does veto, that is something the president has as a power, so that's their check. The president's check right there. Does that mean that the bill is dead? And of course, I'm going to ask you guys, and you're going to say no, it's not dead. It could go back to the Congress, it could go back to the House and Senate, and if the House of Representatives and the Senate approve it again with a 2/3 majority, a supermajority, then that is enough to override the veto. So even if the president says no, that doesn't mean that the bill cannot become the law, okay? Now, generally, of course, the veto is not the way this is going to play out. House and Senate approve the bill, it goes to the president signs it, okay? So it actually enters then into the general arena of activity. But the question becomes, is it unchallengeable? Can someone not challenge it yet? And of course, the answer is yes, you can challenge it, right? And you can challenge the law through the courts. You don't have to necessarily accept that a law passed by either a local government, the state government, or the national government, is because they say that's the way it is. That's the way that's not the way it is at all. So you can, of course, take this through the court system and perhaps all the way to the Supreme Court. You need to know, of course, the Supreme Court does not hear most of the cases. Of course, they're only going to kind of pick and choose the ones that they think are the ones that they should deal with. But if it does go to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court has this final decision, of course. And their decision is, does the law fit with the Constitution? Is it okay? And if that is so, then of course they'll pretty much confirm that law. Or if it does not, then they will give it the essential kiss of death as far as our governing apparatus is concerned, declaring the law unconstitutional. And if you want to do something like that, you got to go back to square one and start all over again, okay? So a system replete with checks and balances where every agency of government is sort of watching the other one and see what they're doing and checking upon it in one way or the other. And of course, there are so many others that we could highlight for you. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but I'm sure you guys know that only Congress can declare war. I have to tell you that this has been such a messed up component of our recent history. We've had a tremendous number of undeclared wars. Some people claim, of course, they complain that we don't support our wars, but our wars aren't declared. There are these interesting kind of problematic police actions. If you declare the war, then you're saying the constituent attitude of the American people is behind the war. If it's an undeclared war, you almost open the door for protest, for those to say, no, this isn't legitimate. If it was legitimate, why wouldn't it be declared war? And Congress, of course, is really, caved into the president, of course, giving presidents tremendous amount of power to take our troops in various locations and utilize them in various ways. And I really think that they are diverting from the intent of the founders. That Congress was supposed to oversee all of these they're supposed to make the ultimate declaration. So, that becomes one of these checks and balances.